Thank you. So, welcome. And let me start by just thanking everybody for coming out here today. I am devastated. I'm competing with a band concert tonight, so it sort of hurts a little bit, but thank you all for coming, and really for the two former student and current student who are going to share their voices a little bit tonight, which is sort of why we're here. When Kathy and I spoke a few months ago now about having this event, I was a little terrified. I'm not gonna lie, I'm still a little terrified, but I was wondering, what can I possibly bring to this library that other much better authors have brought? And so I had to dig deep. I had to think about sort of my origin story, if I may, for my superhero fans. And I think part of it was that this book was for me, and it was really about me finding my voice for nothing else except for me to deal with the things that were happening in my life, which I'm going to talk more about today. And so I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to make this sort of an opportunity for Skokie to find its voice, because it has had such an impact on me and very much an influence on my writing of this story. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy that part of it. So yes, I had the creepy picture of her having the voice torn from her. My husband decided that was a little terrifying, so we listened right on that. All right, so a couple of things that I want to talk about. And one is if you are thinking about doing anything creative, especially if you're thinking about writing, my first question to you is to ask yourself, why are you doing this? And if that answer is not because it's for you, then you probably shouldn't do it. And I know my students are going, well, then I don't have to do my homework, Mrs. Schmidt. But it's really, that's when I was talking about the origin story, it had a lot to do with how I started writing. When I was young, I started writing because I needed to process information that was coming at me, probably during my dramatic hormonal times, and I needed to get the poison of that time period out onto paper. And for some reason, that became very comforting to me. It was as if I was understanding relationships better. I was understanding myself better through that writing. And as I got older, I think it was more about sort of like a pensieve in Harry Potter. I like to pour my memories out onto paper so that I can revisit them later and be put back into that moment. And I think that's sort of the power of writing, is whenever you get caught up in a story, you feel those same feelings that you did if you can relate to the character. And for me, those were my journals. That was the reason why I wrote. And when I was faced with this difficult time in my life, my grandmother was fighting Alzheimer's and dementia, and I really was struggling with being so angry and being so sad about the situation that I was in. And so I chose to start writing the story for me, to process that piece of my life. And so to give voice to the first person, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot right away, but because you've had sort of a difficult year, and I was so honored when Ella came to me and decided to share something that she'd written on her own, for the same reasons I think that I was writing. So this is Miss Ella.
Okay. So I wrote a poem. In our school we did a poetry unit, like kind of outside of her class for reading. And this was just one of the poems I wrote in our journal that we kept. So it's called Fading, and it's based off my grandmother, who fought Alzheimer's as well. And it's kind of like what I saw as she went through it, and all the stuff that happened around her, and how she kind of like deteriorated through time, but also stayed strong as like her true self. So it's called Fading, and yeah. The old woman rubs her wrinkled forehead as she tries to remember her grandchildren's names. Ian, Evan, Ivan. The words slip through her head like rain down the windows of our cars, like the brush through our hair. The tall old man approaches his wife and takes a seat. "Good morning, sunshine," he says with a smile. But the only thing this fading old woman can think is, who is this strange man? He feels defeated, confused, and shocked. "It's me," he pleads, "your husband." Her brain pauses as one by one, like flowers blooming, the memories rise to her head, but not the way she wants them to. Briefly, her fading brain sees the moment. She knows the experience. Her mind grasps the images that she can't hold. Her fingertips reach for the memory that she once had, but somehow this fleeting old woman just can't find the thoughts or the words to express it. Breathe, she thinks to herself. This isn't me. This isn't who I am becoming. Simple, forgotten memories are normal, right? Until the next day, the fading old woman is asked to sign a check. As she looks down at the paper, she can't remember how to sign her name. She can't remember how to spell it even. Until the next week, into her home walk unfamiliar children. Faces she can't remember, but are the ones of her very own grandchildren. And as they all hold their grandma tight, her only thought is, what are these children's names? Until the next month, when the fading old woman is getting dressed, something that should be routine for her, a routine she should never mess up. But yet she still walks out the door with her pants on backwards, and she never notices herself. Until the next year, she knows what she wants, she knows exactly what she's trying to say, but somehow her brain moans the words of the very first language she knew, and it's as if the fading old lady is now a toddler again. And as the pieces add up, it hits her. Her memory has faded, and maybe it's time the fading old lady does too.
It makes me very happy. I'm glad that you have that. I think that's a real tribute. That sort of goes to my next piece, which is probably the greatest lesson that I learned in writing this book, is I found myself having just had my daughter, and I started to write the book. And I was sort of at a crossroads, trying to figure out, do I finish this? You know, it's already sort of done what I needed it to do. I got it out, it's cathartic, I feel better. But then I decided, well, yeah, I have to finish this. I can't not finish something that I started. And then I was at another decision-making point, and that was whether or not to get it published. And I really looked at it like this was going to be a lesson to my children, because I'm going to fail in this. And this is going to be one of those great life lessons that I can pull out later and show Logan and Cora, and I'm gonna say, hey, I tried, I failed, but I came out the other end and I was okay. And I'm really glad that I tried. And I gotta tell you, I think there were 37 rejection letters and countless others that just, they don't even write you back. I mean, the whole process is sort of just a soul sucker. And you get to that point where, oh, okay, I can take the failure, and I got to 38, and who knew, somebody out there actually wanted to publish this story. And I thought that this would not have been as sweet of a success had I not felt all of those failures before. And for those of you that have read the story, a big part of it, I'm sort of mesmerized by the concept of yin and yang. My students will tell you, I teach that in their social studies class. I think the idea of that balance, the idea of not understanding light without the dark, that you can't conceptualize pain if you've never been out of pain, all of it coexists in that way. And I think failure is the same. I think that you can never truly understand the sweet feeling of success if you haven't failed and failed frequently. And I really hope that that's a lesson that I instill on my children, that I instill on my students, because nothing else is worth it if you've never felt that before. So my lesson is to not be, no really, I mean not to fail. And I just love this because she owns her failure. She knocks down the whole thing and really it's just one of my favorites. All right, so you're probably asking yourself, well, I kind of want to do this, but I'm not sure where to start. Do you have any advice on this? And I kind of find it funny when anybody asks me advice, because I'm struggling with this all the time as I'm trying to write the second book for this. I believe that I lack in the two skills that I need, which is probably planning and general writing skill, neither of which are very strong. But I think that I do have three things that you have. And so if you're ever interested in doing something creative, I would recommend these three things. The first is that I'm an avid reader, and I know many of you, especially those who frequent the library, definitely are. And I'm one of those people who I will read pretty much anything. I can even start a book and really hate it, but I have to finish it. There's something about that completion. I have to feel that I've gotten through the whole thing. But I find myself taking little lessons from all of the things that I read, whether it's small pieces of writer's craft, whether it's general story plot, and I kind of keep them in a journal. This is actually the journal that I kept for that book. This is the journal I'm keeping for the second book. And then I have on my phone, I keep notes on my phone, I dictate often on my phone, because I think that, you know, if anyone knows Ellen Gaffney, the woman should be rich and famous because she comes up with these great ideas all the time, but she even never writes them down, so then she can't remember that she had it, 10 days ago. So I tend to try to write them down, and then I'll look back at them later, and I like to look for connections. The other piece, and I know my students and friends will laugh at me, but I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time. I have an hour drive to work, so I listen to them every day. And when I do, I find that they stimulate some sort of new thought, some sort of piece of symbolism or information that I want to find out more about. For example, I listened to a Radiolab podcast a couple of months ago, and it was talking about how there's a network of trees. This just in general, trees work as a network connected by fungi from underground through their root system. And it talks about how from one side of the forest, they communicate with each other to the other side of the forest. So if one side has nourishment and water, they can then send it through the fungi to the other side of the forest. And I thought, this is so cool. This is like a metaphor for life. Everybody should know this. And so I write these things down, and that's something that I try to implement in my stories is, okay, that could be a reflection of the character. That can be something that the character starts to learn. And so those are the things that I pay attention to. And then lastly, I think of myself as an observer of life. I like to pay attention to the small things. I think every day we are inundated with all kinds of negativity, whether it's news stories, whether it's politics, whether it's our own cynicism. But I think it's easy to be overpowered by that. And this is actually a picture that I took. I was on a trip with my husband and a friend, and we were hiking in Seattle on Mount Rainier. And I saw this flower growing in the middle of a bed of rocks. And again, I thought, this is so cool. How can this flower be thriving in this rocky terrain? This is something that you wouldn't expect. And so that was one of those symbols that I wanted to bring to a story, and that's actually partially in the first book. There's a road down the street from where I live where the trees on either side of the road sort of reach over at one another like long lost friends, and it's those moments, I think, that we snapshot and we take in, and if you can refocus on these pieces of the world, I think it makes everything else seem much more tolerable. And with that, I am going to ask that Robbie come up and share. Now, Robbie is a former student of mine. How old are you now, Robbie?
23.
And so I'm very old.
So podcasts did not exist when I had Ms. Schmidt as a teacher.
But Robbie has offered to share a couple of things, and I think the first thing is maybe I'm going to save the Skokie thing for later.
Cool. So I'll preface this by saying that for those of you who know my parents, they're alive and well. This comes from a collection of poems that I wrote. I'm editing with Tom Dixon, for those of you who know him, called The Building Blocks at the Base, which I wrote after reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Kahneman conceptualizes identity kind of as a game of Jenga. It's very easy to touch the blocks at the top, but to go for the building blocks at the base takes great mental effort, and people won't do that even after it becomes necessary. So this collection of poems explores instances in which a person is forced to fundamentally change the way they perceive themselves, but there's a little cognitive dissonance, a pushback. We don't like to do that sort of thing. The poem is called Eulogies for My Parents. Joy Moss was a good woman. Life was not always easy for her. At the dinner table, her stories about work included homelessness, suicide, drug use, and other modern plagues. But at the end of the day, she could always know that she had helped someone. She took us to Long Beach Island with her sisters, the answer in the nest, as we say, a tradition that I will pass on to my children. As a mother, she was loving and affectionate, ready at any moment to help Deb and me teach us how to think, showing us how to love ourselves. It seems now that everything should stop. The earth should stop turning and the sun should go out. The sun shines brightly today, and the world is still turning, maybe even a little faster now. Babies were born today, and life goes on. A book is not over until its final chapter is written. Now the final sentence is penned. Let us reflect on a good life well written. May her memory be for a blessing. John Moss was a good man. He loved to read and watch football. He taught me to love books and myself. Everything I did was good enough for him. He took me canoeing in the Boundary Waters when I was 12, a tradition I will pass on to my children. And he became Jewish so that he could stand on the bimah while I was bar mitzvah. He had bright blue eyes that shone when he laughed, and if I'm lucky, my children will inherit the cutest tush that mom ever saw. It seems now that everything should stop. The earth should stop turning, and the sun should go out. But the sun shines brightly today, and the world is still turning, maybe even a little faster now. Babies were born today, and life goes on. A book is not over until its final chapter is written. Now the final sentence is penned. Let us reflect on a good life well written. May his memory be for a blessing.
Robbie's, I'm not gonna lie, I read that when he sent it to me and I was like, what happened to us? So I'm glad that you clarified that before you read it. But it leads nicely into, sorry, no idea where the mouse goes. It leads nicely into kind of this next idea, which I would recommend is, in general, I think it's important for you to know what's important to you. When I wrote this book, of course, my grandmother was at the epicenter of it, but I was in a place in my life where I was really trying to decide how to parent, what kind of parent I wanted to be. And so when my children were in my tummy, I would write in journals for each of them. And kind of like I said before with that idea of the pensieve, I was really just writing to remember what it was like to be preparing for them. And at the end of each journal entry, I would write a little piece of advice. And mainly for me, I felt like I need to practice this parenting thing. I have no idea what I'm going to be doing, so I should put it down on paper in case I forget how. And so kind of thinking about those lessons, what are the things that I want to teach to my children, that was the essence of this. So it started with my grandmother, but then I started thinking, what are the things that I want them to know about the world? What are the things that I want them to sort of hold in their hearts as they continue to grow and become better people and functioning people in society? And I think that falls under the category of theme. Now, when I wrote the book, I wrote it in hindsight thinking as a teacher and thinking, well, I teach theme, and I teach that, you know, there has to be evidence to support the theme, and there has to be like a right or wrong theme. And so I wrote the book thinking I'm a total fraud. I never planned a theme. People are gonna be on to me. They're gonna know that I didn't start with this master plan and break down into all of these developments of my character, and they're gonna know I don't really write. And then I started to realize that, well, I guess other authors sort of feel like they're frauds too. They don't really plan all these things necessarily. Some do, some don't. But two of my favorite authors, Zadie Smith and Margaret Atwood, I'm sure you've read some of their books. I listened to two separate interviews from these incredibly intelligent women, and they both made a comment saying that they were constantly surprised by how people who read their books would come up with different themes that they hadn't planned on. And so I thought, if they're really smart and they're really good writers, so it's okay, I feel a little bit better. But then I found myself at these book clubs, which are my favorite events to do once people have read the book, so invite me to your book clubs, I would love to do that. But I love hearing what people think of the story afterwards, because you're bringing your own lenses into it as we teach our children. And so it's fascinating to me to be a writer on the other side and able to hear what people take from the text. And as I talked about failure before, not everyone loves the story, and I knew that was going to happen. I don't love every book that my friends love. But what has been so pertinent to me is that the first person, and I will never forget the first person who came to me and said that it made it just a little bit easier to deal with her grandparent who was going through the same thing. And that, I don't care if everybody else hates the book, that was probably one of my favorite moments after writing it. So know what's important to you. Now, I liked to start with the question of what if, and I think Robbie did a beautiful job of kind of addressing that point. Several years before I had started writing this story, I read a book by Cecilia Ahern. She wrote P.S. I Love You, which became a movie. She's written several books, and one of them was, I think, called A Place Called Here. And she took this very simple story. In fact, I was folding laundry before I came here. How many of you have ever felt like you fold laundry and that's one stinking sock is always missing whenever, right? It happens to everybody. So Cecilia Ahern, it was brilliant. She took that concept of, well, where do these lost things go? And she created a world, sort of that what if. What if there was this place that all these lost things go to? And she centered it around a missing persons, mystery. It's a fantastic read. And I thought, I could do that. That's just sort of a simple plot line. And then I thought about all of my favorite stories, even Harry Potter, thinking, what if there was this magical world that existed right under our noses? So I challenge you, because I'm betting that most of you, and anyone who's at all interested in writing, I'm betting that you think about these things constantly, that question of what if. And so I decided to take my pain and say, well, what if there is a reason? What if there is a reason that people have Alzheimer's? What if the reason is that they need to have their brains broken down in order to become rebuilt, to become a highly intellectual human being? What if the reason for cancer is that everybody has the propensity to have cancer? Why is it that certain people develop it and certain people don't? What if the reason is that they needed to break down their bodies in order to become physically superior? So I utilized that simple question and built the story around it. So why did I write this? Well, as I've mentioned a couple of times, this is my grandmother and my grandfather. Today is actually my grandmother's birthday. And, sorry. So I really wanted to have this event on this day for this reason. And I knew, we just went and visited her before we came here today, and I knew she would get such a kick out of this. I think the fact that I've created a story around her where she's a superhero would be like the coolest thing to her. And so, as I mentioned before, I was dealing with this pain. And for those of you that have dealt with Alzheimer's, it's sort of like starting with a puzzle. And I felt very distinctly on one day that some of those pieces were starting to go. And I felt that she was starting to lose the most important pieces to me. And it was so hard, and it made me so mad. And I remember thinking, well, all my life everyone's always said everything happens for a reason. And I thought that was so bogus. I just didn't want to come home and have to tell my children that. It was such an empty sentence to me. And so I wanted to create a reason. And I have to say, a year after publishing this, and now I wrote this almost 6 years ago, or at least I started about 6 years ago, I have found such comfort in believing this story. It has become so much a part of who I am. And there are other people who have read it, who have shared in that. And if for a second, and again, from the beginning, it was for me. It wasn't for anybody else. It wasn't to make money. It wasn't to do anything in particular, but it was to make me feel better. And it absolutely did that. and I still find comfort in that daily. And then lastly, I really wanted to give my kids a little bit of hope. And I think, as I said before, I look at that concept of failure, and we look at all of that negativity that we see on a daily basis. When I first started writing this, I wanted to tie it to true life events. So everything that happens in the book actually happened at some point. Now, I've taken some liberties as a writer to put my characters into these situations, but all the situations were real. And there was one story that I had read, and it's in the book, that there was a subway accident. There were 77 people standing on the subway, and a woman fell down and was having seizures on the subway rails, and only one person did anything. And in the article that I read, they were very fixated on the fact that 76 other people did nothing. And I kept thinking, well, what about this guy that jumped down in front of a train and saved this woman? Why is that not the focus? That's what I want my kids to see. I want them to see the flowers and the rocks. I want them to see those trees. I don't want them to pay attention to everything else and have that bog you down, because it is so easy to let that weigh you down entirely. And then lastly, it's because I absolutely love this city. I think that I have learned more in 15 years of working here than I ever learned in between the four walls of any university or any high school that I attended. I have learned more from my students, I am positive, than I ever taught them. And I am so impressed with not just the diversity, but the tolerance, the respect, the love, the admiration that people have for one another here. And it comes out in conversations that I have in my classroom, and I could never replicate that. But there is pieces of it in the story. And I may not have been intentional about my themes, but I am very intentional about the names, as some people don't love all the names in the story, but especially in some of the classroom scenes, many of my former students will see their names in the book. They do exist. But I think that Robbie did a fantastic job of articulating why Skokie is so impeccable. And one other student who was not able to attend tonight, her name is Haya Ahmed. I don't know if anyone knows her, but she sent this to me just as I was coming over here today. So I'm gonna go ahead and read it, as it is beautiful. She said, "Dear Skokie, thank you for being you. When I was growing up and didn't feel like I fit in because of my skin color and beliefs, you were there to assure me that it was okay to be me. I'd be astonished when people didn't know what Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur was, because I was educated about it. I've been to 5 bat mitzvahs and have friends from all around the world. I grew up going to schools with teachers who accepted me. My high school championed diversity, speaking over 90 of the world's languages. It was comforting to see that I wasn't someone who stuck out. I was a 10-minute drive from the greatest city in the world. I had the best of both worlds, city and suburbia. I never thought of leaving you behind. Now that I am out in the world, away from you, I miss you. I miss your accepting nature. I miss the diversity at the grocery store. I wish that my daughter grows up in a place like you that gives her the same experiences I had. I hope the other kids here feel the same way about you. Here's to you. Thank you."
So Ms. Schmidt put this feeler out, and I prepared some remarks. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
Because I know that you feel you've learned a lot from this city, but growing up here, I'm going to talk about how much I learned from this city, but I also learned a lot from our teachers. And one of the most amazing things about Skokie is how much we invest in our students and also in our teachers, who do great, great work. And I was personally taught by no fewer than 1, 2, 3 people in this room to whom I owe a huge debt of gratitude. So thank you to all of you. But on growing up in Skokie, it's very difficult to recognize the assumptions that make up your worldview. Asking a man to articulate his general beliefs about the world is a lot like asking him, what does the color green look like? Of course, he has an opinion on the subject, but it's more a collection of memories or an association with objects than it is a real articulatable thought. As I grow, and particularly in light of the current political climate, I'm cognizant that I am an accumulation of experiences that I've had throughout my life. In the Skokie of my childhood, many things seemed normal or nonchalant that now stand out to me as being very unique. I learned to say hello in 13 different languages from my elementary school classmates. My friend Omer used to take a break from playing video games for his 5 times daily prayer. My friend Mazdak's father was a political exile of Iran. There are not many places in the world or in America where people of Jewish, Pakistani, and Iranian heritage can coexist. Nor are there many high schools where the orchestra's principal bassist can also be the only white player on the basketball team. So to sum it up, I'd say that in this case, the lawn signs have it right. Skokie welcomes everyone.
Told you it was good. So I'm going to leave you with sort of 3 pieces. Keep learning. I think that as long as you continue to ask why, don't allow yourself to stagnate, do what you need to do to find your voice. And as people from Skokie, you have so much to give the rest of the world. Choose to share it in some way, whether it's sharing your writing in a place like we have today, having conversations, but keep pushing for change, keep pushing others to change, and that I know will make all the difference in the world. So, thank you. I got through it. Any questions?
Your grandmother's still alive?
My grandmother
And how's
is
she doing?
still living. She is happy as a clam. I mean, she today was laughing with us and having a good time. She just unfortunately doesn't really remember.
Yeah.
She sort of remembers, I think, you and my aunt a little bit more than.
She did say, where did the other one go?
Yeah, I'm the other one.
At home or in an institution?
She's in an institution, not too
Yeah.
far from here,
Okay.
actually.
All right.
Yeah.
Where do you teach?
At Old Orchard Junior High. Yeah, 15 years. Yeah. Any other questions? All right.
To what extent, when you're writing characters, there's at least one character in the book that I'm sure you personally identify with, and some of them are your former students. But to what extent do you envision other characters as other people, or do you try to personally get in their shoes and see things from their perspective?
That's a great question. I think it sort of depends on, and you've read the book, right? Because we talked about this, but I think it depends. When it started, of course, they were real people to me. You know, I mean, the main character was my grandmother in my head. There were moments where, I steal idiosyncrasies from real life, either interactions that I have with people, sometimes myself. I think that it's probably a perfect division of both. I would say half the characters in there are 80% mimicked from other people, and then the other half are, it became so real to me. It got to a point where I've always loved writing, but when I wrote that, they started to become family members. Even the characters that were not my grandmother, but I found myself running and thinking about their backstories and creating these pieces to their puzzle that I wasn't necessarily putting in the book, but made them richer, at least in my head. But I think I had the luxury of time in that I was only writing, I wrote it in a week, and then I kind of just put it aside, and then maybe 6 months later, because I was teaching, so it was whenever I was off of work, I would work on it again. And I think that behooved me because I was then away from it far enough to come back with fresh eyes and say, oh, okay, this character's a little bit more like this. And you know, I like to mimic off reality as much as I can because that's what I relate to when I read. I prefer characters that I can visualize that feel like a friend. So I try really hard to write them that way, but it's very strange talking about myself as a writer in general, so I'm not sure I plan nearly as much. Any other questions? Mariah.
Tell us about the new book.
Okay.
Was it
Tell us
very
about-
difficult to experience that when you're writing that, when you think of your grandmother, or?
Emotionally difficult, you mean? I think so in the beginning, but I think it became so cathartic to me. It became so fun to think that this was her, this is where she's going, this is what's happening right now, that I was energized by that. So, you know, there were times when, because my husband and I, Gavin and I would bounce ideas off of each other constantly, you know, and I was just kind of going, what do you think if I make this character do this? What should we do with this? And so it became more exciting, I think, than it was anything else, because I'd never done anything like this. So I think now, you know, I get emotional when I talk about my grandmother in a setting like this, but when I see her, I'm genuinely comforted. I mean, I feel so much better now than I did 6 years ago. Granted, it's been 6 years, it's sat with me a lot longer, but I'm happy that I did it. I think of it as something that she would be proud of, and that helps. You know, feels like it's made it worth it. What were you gonna say, Joe?
I was gonna ask you about the black journal.
The black,
Your new
what's
book.
in the black journal?
Yeah, what's in that journal?
I am writing sort of a sequel to that, so I've just started the beginning of it, but I have a vision of my characters. There's a new character in it, but it kind of continues on with Tom and you know, some of the other characters. Any other questions? Kathy?
Since you teach young adults, have you ever thought about writing for young adults?
You know, whenever I envision myself writing anything in general, I thought I would write a young adult novel. Maybe one day I will, but I also think it's sort of saturated right now. It sort of seemed like the cool thing to do. So, but honestly, I think the best books, you know, I'm rereading Harry Potter with my kids right now, and I think the best books resonate with all ages, and they're sort of timeless in that way. So I'm hoping that maybe the story will be at some point. Any other questions?
When you're dealing with a lot of personal and sensitive issues, is it hard to go public with it?
That's a great question. It is such vulnerability, and I've always taught that. I think as when I was teaching English, especially in 8th grade, I felt like as a teacher I needed to give of myself to expect students to give of themselves in their writing, and that's sort of the beauty of being an English teacher, I think, above any other subject. But when I wrote this, I remember distinctly printing it out and holding it in my hands for the first time, and it was like my third child. And then it was horrifying to think that other people were going to read this. And this was all of a sudden, like, and I know, you know, some of my friends have read it and have a hard time because they hear my voice in it so much, and it's a little too close to home sometimes. I think the hardest part for me is just putting it out for people to be critical. You know, I genuinely want feedback because I want to make my next book better if this is something that I want to continue doing. And I think that's hard when, you know, people that you know are reading these pieces. I am very aware of creating characters that don't represent people that I know too well, because I don't want anyone to feel insulted by little things that I've stolen from them. But I think that's the hardest part. It's just not my comfort zone to do this. I love teaching. That is very much what I see myself doing forever. This is much more difficult to me because, like you said, it is much more personal. And you really have to work hard to be a writer. No one really told me that it was so hard to market yourself and make it. I mean, you really have to sell yourself just as much as you have to sell the book. And that's just not my style. I'm not a huge fan of, you know, putting it out there all the time, so. Any other questions? Yeah.
What grade do you teach?
I taught 8th grade for 10 years, and I'm on my 5th year of 6th grade, but I teach a little bit of 7th grade too.
So, what type of subject?
Right now I'm teaching social studies, but we also teach language arts, and then in 8th grade I taught strictly language arts.
What was that, the last?
Language arts, reading and writing.
Okay.
Jamie?
When you're writing, even if it's like a novel or just writing in general, how do you let go of expectations people have to meet? And how do you like tell yourself that you're writing for yourself? And not like
You know, I have to say I had it easy because when I wrote it, I had no thought at all about anyone else reading it, other than maybe Gavin. So I think that was very freeing. And as I said before, I really wanted to teach my kids that don't be afraid to fail. So that was a driving force for me. I felt like, all right, I'm caught in it now. There's no getting out now. I better get through it on some way. And I felt that way the first time I told students that I had written a book. I felt like, oh, now it's out there. If I don't do something with this, they're all gonna know. And that probably motivated me more to keep pushing forward with it and not let myself lay down once I fell down. But I do recommend, and Jamie's also a beautiful writer, but I do recommend just writing. I think that great writers tend to get caught up in trying to find the right words, and then they get to that stop point and can't get past it. And I am a firm believer in just get it out, and you can always go back and change it later, but it's more important to keep going with it and not get caught up in those little obstacles.
Related, how much was there that you wrote down and like really fleshed out that didn't make it into the book? And were there any like big hurdles with like an editor or a publisher about things that you wanted in that they wanted to leave out or something?
I am an overwriter. Anyone who has read anything that I've written, I tend to overwrite. So there wasn't much that I planned that I didn't put in because in my head it all makes sense. It sounds great. And then when I was working with the publisher, I anticipated, I looked at it like, I'm not really a writer. A publisher's gonna make me a writer. This will be great. That doesn't really happen so much either. He did cut a lot. I mean, I think he cut like 20,000 words, but there was nothing that I felt like I needed to fight him on. He's the nicest person on the planet, and he would listen to anything that I had to say about my writing, but I trust his judgment much more than I trusted my own. So there was a lot that he cut. I'd have to look back into the journal, but I don't think there was too much that I didn't attempt to put in the first place, but it was cut later.
when you first started writing, was this like your original story plot, or did you change it along the way as you were writing?
That's a good question. I have to look at Gavin. Did we change anything? I can't remember really changing it. And change, but not from the publisher though, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember. It's been a while. Don't tell me later. I would say general plot line. I mean, I kind of knew how I wanted it to end. I definitely went back and forth on what I wanted to do with the characters, how I wanted to close it out. I wouldn't say there were terribly large changes, though. No.
Do you ever go through a period of a dry spell?
I don't have time for dry spell. I would say I just, it's just the way that I focus my time. I have papers to grade, I have children to raise, I have life to lead. So if I can find time to read or to write, then great. If not, I'm probably reading, and then it's motivating me more to get back to it. There are moments where I am much more driven. We went on a vacation, and I think I wrote like 16,000 words on the plane a couple weeks ago, and that was the most that I'd written since I'd written that. But I write articles for, my publisher has 2 magazines, and I write nonfiction articles for him. And I've really enjoyed that. And I don't find I have many dry spells with that because they're shorter, sweeter. They're usually the impetus is my podcast listening, so I always have things that I feel like I wanna talk about, and so that helps.
Like, how do you get over like writer's block?
Get over writer's block? Well, like I said before, I think writing, just sit down and write. And a lot of times, I had read once that some author who goes through writer's block will like take the idea and just start writing on a page all around it, the other things that he sees about a particular character or a particular scene, but maybe he can't get the whole scene out. And I have tried doing that a couple of times, and it's gotten me back into the game of just writing a little bit more. But again, I would read, and read good stuff that really engages you, and then model your stuff after. Hi.
How do you actually get your words on the board? What ideas ever come on?
Put the words onto a page. I think keeping a journal really helped me. You know, I started to sort of map out, all right, this is gonna go into this character, this is gonna go into that character, and it helped me to have a better understanding of that planning. I didn't do that as much on the first book. You know, the first book was much more emotional vomit. You know, I just wanted to start writing and get it out onto the page. So I don't think I planned as much as I'm planning the second one. But I think everything works differently for different writers too. You know, certain music can make me just go. Certain emotional moments that I have just make me go. It sort of depends, but when it happens, I would write it and don't let anything stop you. Turn your phone off. Don't talk to anybody, and go with it when you're really feeling like you can get through that. Mm-hmm.
Did you research Alzheimer's?
A ton.
And that's,
Yeah, yeah.
So my question would be, what made you decide to go with a novel versus nonfiction? This is a true story about your life.
Mm-hmm. One, because I don't think anyone cares about my life. I don't think, you know, a nonfiction, I'm not terribly interesting. And two, I think if you've ever read any Dan Brown books, I've always been connected to stories that feel like nonfiction, but you're so embedded in a character that's traveling through these realistic things. And I really wanted my book to feel the same way. I wanted there to be real life events that, even though it had this, you know, the concept almost is sort of mystical, the rest of it seems very real.
How do you get the title for your book?
I don't know how it popped into my head, but I think I thought of it as I was writing the story and thinking that this was what it's about. I want this book to be a symbol of what I am remembering for my grandmother, something that she'd lost. And so as I was writing, then I found the characters kind of thinking and saying using that same concept. And so it felt right to me. I'm not sure it rolls off the tongue so great. You know, I find when I'm saying it or other people, I'm thinking that maybe wasn't the best title for this book, but I like the concept of it more than anything. I read something about that death never really comes until the last person says your name, because they are constantly remembering who you were. And so you may have left this world, but you consistently exist. And I think that sort of resonated, that it's all about me remembering my grandmother and remembering her stories, and then she never really left. Any other questions? All right. I will go back, and if you'd like to purchase books, I can sign books, but if you'd like to donate to Alzheimer's, I do give to the Alzheimer's Association, and they've been wonderful through this process, so thank you.
Thank you.